Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and welcome to another podcast from Funding the Future. Today, I welcome back my old friend, John Christensen. We co-founded the Tax Justice Network together and have known each other for about a quarter of a century and have furiously agreed on many things and quietly disagreed on quite a number of others along the way.
Not always so quietly, Richard. You won't get away with that one.
Okay, sometimes we've disagreed furiously as well then. And the point is that over that time, we've developed a lot of thinking together. And that's why John is a good guest to have here, because we know how to explore ideas without always necessarily requiring that we come to agreement. So welcome, John.
Yeah, thanks. And you're quite right. It's not necessary to come to agreement. Sometimes, there are no, there's no way of coming to an agreement because much of what we're dealing with is complicated, changing all the time. And although history does teach us some lessons, it tends to rhyme. It really doesn't tend to run exactly as one can expect. So very often when we're talking about things in the future, it's not possible to agree. We can just have a good conversation about it.
Okay, let's have a conversation. As I seem to remember somebody once said on some chat show or other, you chose the subject of today's discussion, John. Please introduce.
Yes, well, this takes me back to a period when I was working in the government economic service, and specifically I was working in Jersey, and I was responsible for, this is in the 1980s, the late 1980s through to the mid 1990s. I was the director of Jersey's retail price index, its consumer price index, its house price index, and its average earnings index at a time when inflation was running rip. And I want to talk about inflation because what I saw in Jersey, and in many respects, Jersey is a microcosm, just a tiny example of what happens across the world. I saw an inflationary wave which had been building up for quite a long time, for many years before the 1980s. But was actually reaching, no, I wouldn't say the peak, but was reaching that point where it accelerates, and it continued to accelerate after I left. And it was literally destroying the island's economy. It was destroying the island's society and culture. And these changes, as far as I'm concerned, are long-term. They're still ongoing, but they played a very key part in formulating my thinking around the finance curse. Now, the finance curse looks at what happens when an over-powerful financial services sector starts to become a dominant player within an economy. And in the case of Jersey, this is exactly what was happening at that period. When Jersey's retail prices were running at something like double the UK rate, and the UK rate was already high enough, and more importantly and more dramatically, house prices were increasing at an incredible again, more than double the UK level, the UK rate of house price increase. But what was particularly disturbing is that trend continued way beyond the peak of the UK house price thing. And Jersey house prices, just to give you a flavour of the figures involved, Jersey house prices in the last quarter of this year, so it's last available quarter 3, 2025, Jersey house prices for an average house, £580,000, which compares with same time period. This is a snapshot, of course. UK, the nationwide average house price figure, £271,000. So UK prices less than half those in Jersey. Now, of course, house prices in London are much higher than they are of the north, but nonetheless, Jersey, what I saw happening there in the 1980s and the 1990s was an island which was seeing inflation push its cost base up to such an extent that the other existing industries, tourism, light manufacturing, agriculture, horticulture, of course, those industries could no longer profitably operate or invest in such a high cost environment. So they were being crowded out by financial services. And for me, that was evidence of the finance curse at play. So what I want to talk with you about, Richard, is the danger of inflation, who is most harmed by inflation, what can be done about it, and what can be done in particular to help young people in Britain and, frankly, across the rest of the world, but young people in Britain for now, to be able to afford housing to meet their needs, because I know, we all know that housing is beyond rental housing, house purchase, way beyond the ability of most young people to afford it. So those are the
Indeed.
questions.
I mean, John, we are of broadly similar age. We were both born in the 1950s. We both had the advantage of buying properties relatively early in our lives. We have both, therefore, seen significant increase in our UK property values. But I haven't paid for the value of the house where I am sitting now, of course. That isn't what I parted with in cash to acquire this property over the years and moving several properties along the way. I benefited from the fact that property prices have increased enormously. And I think you've done some data on that, curiously starting from the year of your birth, if I remember rightly, just to sort of put a peg in the map. What's the data showing?
Yes, I have done a little bit of research. So I was born in 1956. And again, these are nationwide figures because they're indexed. It's a very long term, and I think a robust index. In fact, I based the Jersey House Prices Index on the nationwide index with a couple of tweaks around the Halifax index. But anyway, in 1956, the average UK house price was £1,884. which just seems incredible. But that reflected an average earnings to price ratio of approximately 1 to 3. And that was the norm at that time. Now, fast forward to 2025, and we're looking at, again, nationwide, giving an average house price for the UK of £271,809. And now, simple arithmetic tells us in nominal terms, over that period, over that almost 70-year period, house prices have increased 144 times, which is staggering. Just run it through your calculator, you'll see that's the figure. And I sat there this morning looking at that figure thinking, can't be right, but it is right. Now, of course, that's nominal, and for much of that period, right the way through to, I would argue, probably the mid-1980s, earnings were rising very fast. But there are a couple of things that I think we need to bear in mind. One of which is that if you go back to 1956, the average household consisted of one person who went outside and earned income from their work, and one person who stayed at home and did the household work and an awful lot of other things around the household, but didn't get paid for doing that work. So quite clear gender differentiation. Now, back at that time, in 1956, the average mortgage lending ratio was about approximately 3 times average earnings. That's what banks used as a rule of thumb. In fact, when I first went for a mortgage, it was 3.5. It increased. Now, in 2024, the average was 6.6 times average earnings index. In other words, banks will lend to a ratio of approximately 6.6 times the average household earnings. And that typically now consists of both partners in the relationship going out to paid work. And that tells you an incredibly important story about the social and economic changes since 1956.
So if there is a theory, the quantity theory of money, and to some extent, if you do have more money, and now I know the velocity of circulation needs to be taken into account here, obviously. But if there is more money in the economy, there is inevitably an inflationary tendency. It at least exists in a latent form. And what we've seen is that banks have created, and we know banks create money by lending. So banks have created all this additional money against the security of property, exploiting people and their ability to go to work, and now requiring both members of a household to go to work, therefore removing the freedom of choice from many, which I think is really important because there is a freedom of choice that did exist. Which we do need to remember. And as a consequence, basically trapping people into a system of buying property around the mortgage. And we should remember that the mortgage, one of the arguments of the way in which the term mortgage is derived, is that it means the grip of death. I mean, mort is death. And it is debt that is going to stay with you until death. And now, bizarrely, mortgages are over such long periods that that is also realistic. I talked to somebody recently who was in their 50s. I'd mentioned this to you before, John, and they have got a 20-odd year mortgage left. In other words, for them, the prospect of retirement is not something that they can even consider for a long time, simply because they're going to have to continue to work until their 70s, unless they can find a way to downgrade their property in some way, to pay off that mortgage. And that is something which is really previously unknown. So we are talking about a problem here which is very focused on young people. And we are both parents of young people. And so we know what that means for them and their friends, and we see it for others. But this is true across many generations. And there's another phenomenon that we must remember that comes out of this, and that is those who've never got access to housing. And there are a growing number of those. About 1 in 6 people in retirement now are living in private rented accommodation, when only a decade or so ago it was about 1 in 12. Those people are trapped paying full commercial rents for the rest of their life out of what might be very small pensions. So we are seeing all sorts of strains arising, including upon the benefit system, because many of those people will be going to get pension credit and other support if that's what they can get from the state, but all of which is designed to basically provide a reward to the landlord, the extraction of rent from the individual and in turn from the state in some cases, to provide this return to finance, to rent extraction to the landlord. And that is an exploitative economy. And that's what really gets me. And I think it's what gets you.
Oh, it totally gets me. But I also think it's an economy that will gradually destroy itself as its cost base rises to that point where investment in productive activity becomes very much less profitable than investment in rentier activity. And there's a problem there. But I think we need to look back a little bit, because when you look at what happened, particularly in both housing markets, in the rentals area and in the ownership area, until the 1970s, for a very long period of the post-war boom, credit control were tightly applied, and banks were very restricted in how much they could lend into the mortgage sphere. And I think that helped to abate house price increases. But you also, and crucially, had a very viable and frankly, in many cases, attractive non-private rental sector. In other words, council housing, which acted as a moderator on the market driven price increases, and which provided many people with a service that is the housing service, with shelter over their heads, and they didn't look to house prices as a means of gathering or accumulating wealth. Now, one of the big problems which I had in discussing house prices in the context of directing a retail price index, which of course includes house purchase and rents. Consumer price index doesn't in the same way include house prices and rents. But the problem I had was that very often there were economists and politicians who were arguing, well, house prices are different because when people's house prices rise, they feel wealthier. And in fact, the Treasury used to call it the wealth effect. And when they feel wealthier, they don't perhaps have the same wage increase expectations that they previously had in other contexts. And they were content to see their house prices rise, even though the houses weren't changed. It was the same house over their head. They felt a great deal wealthier as a result of this. Now, this seems to me to have been a devilish compact, because, of course, as earnings were flatlining through much of that period of the 1980s, 1990s, and so on, for such a vast range of people, they were enjoying their right to buy of existing council housing stock. They were seeing house price appreciation, so they didn't mind so much that their earnings weren't increasing because they felt they were getting wealthier anyway. But the next generation was massively impacted by the house price increase over that period. And this is what I think of as the great wave of inflation, which has engulfed not just Britain, but many European and North American countries, and have harmed their underlying economies, because it's made it that much more difficult for genuine investors to invest in productive activity, because the cost base has become so high compared to the cost base of investing in similar production in Southeast Asia, for example, China or Vietnam or Bangladesh. And of course, we've seen the productivity in those countries and the skilled levels of their workforces massively increase over that period. So we now find ourselves with an extremely high cost base, low productivity growth over several decades. And now, as far as I'm concerned, that rather relaxed attitude towards house price inflation has come back to, I think, it has deeply harmed our economy. Now, I wanted to ask you whether you saw things in a similar way.
I do. I mean, let's be clear, I mean, I've looked at data as well. In fact, by chance, just before I came to record this, literally as I was having my lunch before we recorded this podcast, I was looking at an email which came in, and it said that in 42 out of 47 cities, and I'm not quite sure what the definition of a city was here, but this is a reasonable sized place across the UK, somebody on average earnings will not be able to buy a house. And in London and Oxford and Cambridge, you've got to be on high earnings on average to buy a house. The differential for somebody in those places between the average price and what you can get a mortgage for is you can only get a mortgage for half the average house price if you are on average earnings. So you are basically priced out of the market. And what we also are seeing are some exceedingly frightening ratios with regard to rental property, where many people who are in the private rented sector, and particularly young people, because this is dominated by people under the age of 40, although, as I say, by no means only people under the age of 40, half of income is going on rents. Now, it's unsurprising as a result we have a low growth, low productivity, low innovative economy, because when people are spending half their income on rents, the amount left over for anything else is tiny. The proportion that is available after also paying food and utility and other bills, once you've paid half out on literally putting what may well be a rather inadequate roof over your head, is simply insufficient to let you go out and spend and therefore drive the economy. So the multiplier effects of consumer spending or leisure spending, and I think that leisure spending is an important driver, not only of well-being, just being able to go out and see people and share and even have a cup of tea with somebody. I mean, even that apparently, according to some surveys, shows that some people can no longer just go out and have a cup of tea with people. And yet that social interaction is so important to life, and that's because of the pressure of costs upon them. And if all of those things are taken away, life becomes literally for many miserable. And then people turn around and say, why have we got a mental health crisis? Well, all of this comes down to me to one root, and that is we're paying too much for property. And I agree with you about social housing. I think social housing is fundamental. But if I can for a moment, I'm going to keep on the hobby horse for just a second. One of the things that gets me as well is that when I look at the economy, and I look at the way in which wealth is structured, property is a major source of wealth inside the UK economy, where we are supposed to have around £6 trillion worth of wealth out of a total financial wealth of 15 trillion. And the data's a bit out of date from the Office for National Statistics these days. But then so is everything from the Office for National Statistics these days, a little bit questionable. But when we look at that data and then we compare it with pension wealth, which is roughly the same at 6 trillion overall, but when we look at other factors like cash holdings, there's around 2 trillion of other savings. But there is actually very little of that cash that is now used for productive purposes. For example, very little of it is held with building societies. But building societies, as they were structured, used to be very, very different from banks. Now, there are some building societies still around. There is one in the high street in the town where I live, which is a local building society, and it does actually provide mortgages to local people. And it does act as a deposit taker and a lender. But that isn't how banks work. The vast majority that is held with banks, and they have most of the cash in the UK, is sitting basically dormant. We have lost any form of connection between the process of saving and the process of investment. Now, we need houses. We don't only need houses. I'm sure we'll also agree on this. We need energy transformation. We need environmental change. We need flood defences. We need better hospitals, better schools, and all sorts of things that we can see are crumbling all around us. But without better housing being available to more people, whether that housing be put back into the state sector by building it or sometimes by buying it, because frankly, it would be of benefit to sometimes buy out private landlords and put their properties into secure tenancy situations where people can live knowing that their children can have a long-term prospect in the same school, which is fundamental for children's mental health, because they can then have secure circles of friends and develop in those environments. But if we could reconnect our savings with this provision of social capital to be the bedrock on which we provide the future for our societies by providing affordable homes that are secure for people to live in, and provide mortgages in the way that the US does. And if the US can do it, damn it, we can, where they, when you take out a mortgage, provide a mortgage for 25, maybe maximum 30 years in most cases, and it will be at a fixed rate for life. There won't be any variation. If the Bank of England go and play silly games with the base rate, your mortgage is not going to change in price even when you come off your fixed term deal, which has been, of course, one of the massive drags over the last few years as the Bank of England have forced up interest rates. You will know where you stand for good. And if this, as I say, if the states can do that, we can work out how to hedge the risk within such a mortgage portfolio here just as well. And so this is deliverable. As is that money. I mean, I keep on talking regularly. I'm going to shut up in a moment and ask you an opinion, I promise you. But I keep on talking about reforming ISAs and pension funds so that money is put to social purpose in our savings when the state is subsidising those activities to the tune of 80 billion plus a year now. 70 billion to pensions, over 10 billion to ISAs. Suppose we just spent 80 billion on housing. We wouldn't have Keir Starmer going around on his knees praying to house companies to build a few more. He could just employ direct workforces, something that again have been forgotten about. The DLOs, direct labour organisations that councils used to have in the UK, that built the estates that were the best that we ever established for people with big houses, big size rooms, big gardens so that people could live well. So I think there's this radical transformation. Am I mad, John, or is that sensible?
No, we're in furious agreement here. And I think, I might take it even further. And I would say that we should not just give priority to re-establishing a program of council-led housing provision for younger people. We should make it the sole priority, the sole goal within the current time horizon, let's say the next 10 years, to ensure that, given the existing constraints we have within the construction sector, skills shortages right the way across the thing, we should stop
Yeah.
allowing developers to continue to develop mainly for the very well-heeled and wealthy classes, and focus all of the available resources on re-establishing a large bed of council housing where the prices are, and councils that were generally used to be very good at procuring these, they had their own direct labor organizations, but they also were good at contracting at local level. So I would give that a priority.
Absolutely.
Just
And
want to
that's
pick up on
important too.
one thing that you mentioned, because I mean, I live in London, as you know, or near London. And going back to the nationwide data, I just noticed a figure this morning when I was looking at this. Earlier, I quoted a house price to earnings ratio of 6.6 to 1. But the London figure, and that was the UK average, or the England average, the London figure is 11 to 1. And I am stunned when I talk to young people who are working in professional areas, including, young lawyers and doctors and teachers and so on, all of whom seem to think that buying a house is way beyond anything they could envisage for the very long term. So they kind of think that they're stuck in private rental accommodation for the rest of their lives beyond retirement, which is quite simply unaffordable. And I think you're quite right earlier when you said that these things impact most heavily upon young people. I think it absolutely does. And I think to a certain extent, it explains why young people have become increasingly disenchanted with the current economic settlement, in totally disillusioned with the main political parties, including the current party in government, because they don't think, and I think they're right, they don't think that these governments have even begun to get their heads around, let alone show genuine interest in the problems in how to match the needs of young people with the existing market-led provision in the housing market. There's a complete there's a chasm in the ways of thinking, and the current government seems to think that a market-led approach is the only one to pursue. And yet we have seen over the last 40 years that the market-led approach has by and large failed to meet the needs for affordable accommodation for young people.
I can add another thing. I agree with all of that. I want to add another idea here. And that is that we were talking about inflation. And of course, what we really need at the moment is either significant increase in wages, so we reduce these differentials between wages and house prices, or we need a significant fall in house prices, or we need to have a movement in both directions. But either way, we have got to the point where, frankly, this ratio is literally at breaking point. And I think it is at breaking point. We're seeing the impact in all sorts of ways. Falling childbirth rates, for example. I'm one of 3 these days. The number of families who can think about having one of 3, or even plan 2, which is what my parents did, and I came as the extra one in the job lot because I'm a twin. Whatever way we look at it.
Well, as you know, I'm one of 7, and there was an 8th because I am also one of a twin. So,
and I know your twin did not live. But yeah,
right.
I mean, so these things are just not on people's horizons anymore. And this is the key point. Society is being changed by this, fundamentally changed.
Yes.
And I find that the most troubling aspect of all. But if we go back to it, what we're going to get are bankers, and bankers are powerful lobbyists. And we know that. We have come across bankers many times in our careers. We've run up against them very willingly and argue with them at length. And they will argue, oh, if you do this, you will undermine the credibility of our balance sheets. We will not have the assets to support the loans that we have supplied. Therefore, we will fail to meet our capital loan requirements. And you did mention, by the way, capital controls. And I think that capital controls are a key part of this into the future. And it was interesting. I talked to Larry Elliott on this channel recently, and he agreed that capital controls are fundamental to what we need to be looking at in many areas, including this one. So we aren't the only two talking about that.
That's interesting, because I've talked to a number of people about capital controls and economist studies, and there seems to be a kind of convergence of thinking around here, a return to the idea that capital controls are necessary. But let's face it, government after government in the last 40 years has needed to step in one way or another to prop up the balance sheets, the over dependent on property prices balance sheets of banks across the spectrum. And in many cases, these government measures, I'm thinking about George Osborne's, short-term stamp relief, stamp duty relief, or the short-term measures to help first-time entrants. They don't benefit first-time entrants to the market. They tend to benefit the vendor, in other words, the existing wealth holder. And of course, it benefits the banks because it keeps their balance sheets propped up. And
Well, can I just mention George Osborne? Can I jump in there, John?
Just one thing. How long do you think we can continue to sustain these zombie banks?
Well, this is the point, that I don't know we can sustain these zombie banks for very long. I mean, apart from the fact that we are at the moment sitting and waiting for a share price crash, we're already seeing Bitcoin collapsing all around us. It's gone down by roughly a third in the month before we're recording this, and share prices are falling steadily, but not catastrophically on any one day at present. But it does look as though there is a share price correction going on, and all of that is likely to have a knock-on effect for banks who are going to be exposed to what is happening there, but they're going to be exposed to the property market as well. And at some point, there's going to be a property price correction. And the government has stepped in the past to actually save them from this, not just in the ways you're talking about, which were very visible, but actually in the mid-teens of this century. George Osborne, again, towards the end of his time as Chancellor, advanced over 100 billion to banks to support the mortgage market, to basically keep prices high and on their balance sheets of worth, because he didn't feel as though enough was being pumped out into mortgages. And he gave the banks the money through effectively a QE scheme to achieve that goal. And now I believe that we need to be thinking very differently. We've actually got to deleverage the banks with regard to these property assets. And that's why we need a national mortgage scheme. That's why we need to redirect savings from useless deposits in banks, which have nothing to do with the money they advance, into effectively a national scheme which reconnects the saving with the mortgage amounts, albeit in a state-run system, but a national mortgage, which then basically takes mortgages off banks' balance sheets so that they will have, and this is very kind to them in my thinking, I think I'm being incredibly generous, but I want them to have a relatively soft landing, because hard landings when it comes to banks are very expensive, simply because we haven't done something that I recommended we should do in 2008, which was create a national payment platform, a gyro bank, if you like, to make sure that everybody can access a payment system if ever banks fall over again. Because we were in hock to the banks in 2008 and had to bail them out because we literally couldn't pay or using our credit or debit cards. And they existed then, of course, as much as they do now, to pay the supermarket for the food we needed. And therefore, we had to bail out the banks at one weekend in October when RBS decided to fail in 2008. Well, we want to remove that stress again. And we do that, first of all, by creating a national bank. And letting everybody bank with the government, which means they wouldn't need, by the way, a deposit guarantee on the funds that they place, because in fact the government can always create the money to repay you, and therefore will take the risk out of banking with these people for the first instance. And secondly, we'll take the problem on their balance sheet of overvalued properties, which are going to not provide the security they have for their mortgages, away from them by putting those mortgages into the government balance sheet instead, where that can be managed, because the government has a bigger capacity, a bigger risk availability, and a national balance sheet which can afford to bear this risk. So we've got to get to the point where we actually take the banks and their ability to create money, and let's be clear, that's what we're talking about, under license from the Bank of England, which they've had since 1844, a license to print money ever since the Banking Act of that year. And we've got to take that license back and control it through capital controls and put bankers in their place again, which is to provide a service to society. And instead, we've had bankers destroying society and creating asset price inflation, which has been destructive of us all.
Well, here to all of that. And you're absolutely right about the way in which the bankers have been incentivized to lend money to promote asset price inflation. And that's the underlying problem within the current housing market. I fear that if we don't take action against this, we are going to quite soon come to the end of a fairly long wave, a great wave of inflation. And economic historians talk in terms of great waves of inflation actually destroying entire economies, societies, and cultures. I fear that we're reaching the peak of a great wave, which I think arguably began in the 60s, accelerated through the 70s, particularly after the OPEC oil crisis, and is now reaching what economic historians would probably kind of categorize as the fifth stage of the great wave, which is the stage when the wave peaks and crashes. And typically what happens at the time of the crash is that you have a rapid collapse of asset prices, that is house prices, but also, of course, as you said, cryptocurrency or crypto asset prices, stock market prices across a very wide range of assets. But also you see falling rents and falling interest rates. And typically what happens after that is you enter into a period of deflation, but it's quite a long period. These things play out in some cases over decades, economic contraction, and things get very much worse because as we arguably now find ourselves in, we have entered an age of monsters, of political demagoguery, political failure. The old institutions of the post-war democracy are falling away. We're entering a period of increasing social alienation, violence in the United States, distinct possibility of long-term civil war there. So I think we're seeing the peak moment and in the final stage of a very long great wave period, certainly in Europe and UK, and arguably in the United States. And if you look at, and the historians, have identified 4 great waves of inflation between the 13th century and the 21st century. If we look at just one of those great waves, which was the 18th century great wave, that engulfed most of Europe. And in the case of France, it reached its climax towards the end of the 18th century with the French Revolution, and then the rise of the Napoleonic dictatorship, and over a decade of war and social devastation spanning Europe, Egypt, the West Indies, the East Indies, South America, the Indian Ocean. So these great waves of inflation have profound and frequently dire consequences. And my concern is, whilst politicians only concern themselves with a very short run, and the banks feel confident they'll be bailed out, they'll leave it too late to actually be in a position where they can mitigate the current great wave of house price inflation.
I agree with, I've looked at these theories as well. I understand them. And it's worth looking at, just reminding ourselves of some of that data. There was a period of interim period from about 1860, and you can argue when it lasted to. You can argue it lasted until 1940, actually. But if you look from 1860 onwards until the turn of the century, over that 40 years, there was net deflation in the UK.
Yes.
Food prices in 1900 were lower than they were in 1860. And that wasn't just because of technical innovation, because in fact, the big technical innovation, the coming of the railways, had happened by 1860. Of course, there were other changes as well. But the point is that actually this was a period of relative stagflation, quite surprisingly. And we don't think of the Victorian era in that way. But once the boom of the railway era and all the hype, and that was very equivalent to the arrival of the internet and AI and everything else had happened, there was a very difficult period for the economy. Banks collapsed.
1873. 1873
There
was
was the Gurney Bank collapse and others in that period, which were really the last major banking crisis before Northern Rock in 2007. It was that long was the banking crisis era. But we now face a situation where either governments act, as you say, in the light of this fifth wave of the current inflationary environment. And I think you're right, we are there, where we're also reached a point where, frankly, party politics is ceasing to be very relevant. Party politics has ceased to be political. It has become about gameplay. It's become about showmanship. It's become about career progression, about competing companies. Because frankly, the Labour Party and the Tories are no more than competing companies, and they aren't actually social movements or representing social interests. And we are at a point where we don't know what's going to happen. And either we have an emergence of new thinking, which is what I know we've been talking about working on for a long time. Our work around tax justice and everything has been all headed in this direction. Or we are going to face a period of some calamity. So unless governments are going to take on the sorts of ideas we're talking about, tackling inflation, tackling the banks, tackling capital controls, bringing in regulation to actually protect people and to provide people with the chance to live again, which is what I want them to have, bluntly, because life is not as good now, in my opinion, for young people as it was for me in the 70s. And everyone says the 70s was a terrible era, but I don't recall it that way at all. I can only remember that I had the chance of a job, the chance of a house, the chance of the career, and I could leave university with a couple of £100 of overdraft and clear it in a summer of work in a brewery before I started my professional career. It was that easy in those days.
absolutely. And there's one
like
other
that.
part of the equation. In the 1970s, almost all of us had the chance of, frankly, quite a good pension provision when we came to the end of our careers. And that...
Yeah, I mean, I didn't worry about it.
No, well, one wouldn't, but it was, for young people now, the idea of having a proper pension provision in the UK at the end of their careers is increasingly pie in the sky, because they simply aren't able to save over that long term, because so much of their income is going to service existing debt, whether it's university fees, university debt or housing debt. They are massively indebted. Now, I think you're absolutely right about the politics of this. Though I don't think democracy is doomed. I just think we're going through a period. There will be a reshaping of this, but the politics of this is that unless they start thinking differently about how to tackle inflation, and there the ideologies, the underlying ideologies about what are the drivers of inflation are massively different. I still think we're too beholden to monetarist theory and monetarist theory, which is largely around, the supply of money and the velocity of money circulating through the economy. Their prescription is interest rates, raise interest rates to tackle high rates of inflation. But that has been so incredibly damaging when it's actually been implemented. And, you have been waxing about that for a hell of a long time. It has profound and harmful economic and social consequences. Inequality rapidly worsens, investment in productive activity tanks, unemployment, generally speaking, rises, but productivity has also falls way below trend level. So we need to move away from that. And one of the things we need to do to recognize, particularly in the last 5 years, post-COVID, post-Ukraine, is that at least of a proportion, I wouldn't want to put a figure on it, but a proportion of the inflationary changes, the price changes in the last 5 years, have not been driven by demand factors. They've been driven by the sheer ability of monopolists to price gouge their customers, whether it's the energy market or consumer products or commodity markets.
Food.
Across the board, there has been price gouging, and that reflects the fact that governments have taken a rather lax position on monopoly and antitrust.
Neoliberalism has failed us, John. I actually read a quote, again, fortuitously this morning, but it's a good one. It's from one of my heroes, John Kenneth Galbraith. And he said, the trouble for Professor Friedman's economic policies is they've been tried. and found wanting. That's where we are. They have been found wanting. The trouble is that we found them wanting maybe 30 years ago, and we're still trying to use them. And until we get over neoliberalism, and as you say, the idea that interest rates do, for example, control inflation, when there's absolutely no evidence to support that, with regard to the vast majority of the types of inflation that we have seen in recent decades, then we're going to be stuck where we are. John, we've been talking, and this surprises me, for apparently 45 minutes. I don't think we can keep people with us.
I haven't even started on my hobby horse.
Yes, I know. So am I. And I know we could keep this going for a long time. The point is, and first of all, I want to thank you for this conversation. And secondly, I think we have actually got somewhere. And I think it's helped me. It's helped shape my thinking. And that's what these things are always about. We have a problem. We have a crisis. It's not just a problem. We have a crisis. Young people have a crisis. We have a housing crisis. We have a financial crisis. We have a banking crisis. We have an crisis with how to control inflation. And unless we have a willingness by government to now come forward and intervene and take steps to manage this proactively by, as you say, capital controls, changing the way we manage inflation, and as I put it, changing the way in which we provide mortgages and fund social housing, we aren't going to get through this crisis in a way that's going to be comfortable, because history isn't telling us great stories on every occasions when we get to the end of an inflation cycle, which is where we probably are. That, I think, is a place to leave. Have you got an afterword, a final thought?
No, I think you've captured it perfectly there. And I also think that what you've done is you've brought a sense of urgency. We are, I'm convinced, reaching or at that peak point. And unless action is taken very rapidly to mitigate it, the consequences could be catastrophic.
You're right. And let me put this in context. I suspect that this podcast is going to be broadcast the day before Rachel Reeves' budget in November 2025. My fear is we are going to hear nothing that is going to tackle the issues that we're talking about here, John. My suspicion is that you and I are going to be talking again sometime soon, and I look forward to it.